Somewhere out there, in the unimaginable darkness between the stars, there could be a ship the size of a small city, carrying every human being who will ever know it as home. The people aboard it were not born on Earth. They will never see Earth. And they will be long gone before the ship reaches anywhere at all. This is why the dream of escaping to another star is so much stranger and so much more fragile than it first appears. Because the moment you do the math, you realize the journey itself becomes a world, a sealed and self-contained universe that has to keep breathing, keep eating, keep believing in a destination none of its passengers will live to touch. Before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more journeys into the cosmos. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. The nearest star to our Sun is called Proxima Centauri. It sits a little over 4 light-years away. That sounds close, almost neighborly, the way the house at the end of the street sounds close. But a light-year is the distance light travels in a single year, and light is the fastest thing that exists. Light crosses the gap between the Earth and the Moon in about 1.25 seconds. It crosses the entire width of our solar system, out past the orbit of Neptune, in only a few hours. And yet to reach Proxima Centauri, that same beam of light, never slowing, never resting, would need more than 4 years. That fact alone should give us pause. Light is not merely fast. It is the fastest anything can possibly be, the absolute speed limit woven into the deepest laws of the universe, a barrier that no ship, no signal, no object of any kind can ever cross. Nothing in all of reality outruns light. And even light, that ultimate sprinter, needs more than 4 years just to reach our nearest stellar neighbor. The number sounds modest until you hold it against the speeds we can actually achieve, and then the true horror of the distance reveals itself. Now think about how slow we are compared to light. The fastest object human beings have ever built is a small spacecraft that skimmed close to the Sun, and at its peak, it moved at roughly 690,000 kilometers per hour. That is faster than anything our species has ever flung into the dark. And at that blistering, record-shattering speed, the trip to Proxima Centauri would still take around 6,500 years. To put a single number against that, all of recorded human history, from the first written words pressed into clay tablets to this very moment, fits comfortably inside that span with room to spare. A ship leaving today at our best possible speed would not arrive until a future as far ahead of us as the invention of writing is behind us. Look up on a clear, dark night, and the stars seem to gather close, a glittering crowd scattered across the sky, as though you could almost reach out and gather a handful. It is one of the great illusions of being human. Those points of light are not close at all. They are suns, many of them larger and brighter than our own, flung across distances so vast that the light entering your eye tonight left some of them before the first cities were ever built on Earth. When you look at the night sky, you are not seeing the stars as they are. You are seeing them as they were, each one showing you an image carried across years, or centuries, or thousands of years of empty space. The light is a messenger, and the message is always old. This is what the dark between the stars truly means. It is not the comfortable darkness of a night that ends at dawn. It is a gulf so wide that light itself, the swiftest thing that exists, takes years to cross even the smallest stretch of it. And we, bound by physics to speeds a tiny fraction of light's own, would take far, far longer. To grasp the scale of the problem, consider our fastest machines once more. The swiftest object we have ever built tore away from the sun at a speed that would carry it around the entire Earth in a matter of minutes. By any human measure, it is unthinkably fast, faster than a rifle bullet many times over, faster than anything in our ordinary experience. And yet, against the distance to even the nearest star, that blistering speed becomes a crawl, a journey not of days or years but of thousands of years, longer than the span from the dawn of agriculture to the present day. This is the wall that every dream of reaching the stars crashes into. The distances are not large in the way a continent is large, or even in the way the solar system is large. They are large in a way that defeats the imagination, large enough that the journey ceases to be a trip and becomes instead an inheritance, something begun by one set of hands and finished, if it is finished at all, by hands not yet born. This is the problem that gives birth to the idea of the generation ship. If no single human can survive the journey, then perhaps a chain of humans can. You send not a crew, but a community. Parents who will live and grow old and pass away aboard the vessel. Children born in the corridors who will never know a sky. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a line of descendants stretching down the centuries, each generation handing the ship to the next, like a torch passed in the dark. The first crew chooses to go. Every crew after them is simply born into the going. It is worth noting that the generation ship is not the only answer anyone has dreamed up to the problem of distance. There are others, and looking at them briefly helps reveal why the generation ship, for all its terrors, keeps drawing us back. One idea is to put the crew to sleep. Not ordinary sleep, but a deep suspended state, the body cooled, its processes slowed almost to stillness, so that a person might pass the centuries unaging, to be revived only when the destination is near. If it could be made to work, it would sidestep nearly every problem at once. A sleeping crew breathes little, eats nothing, needs no farms, no schools, no society to hold together across generations. They would simply close their eyes near one star and open them, seemingly moments later, beneath another. But we do not know how to do this for a human being, not for centuries, perhaps not even for years. The body is not a machine you can switch off and on again. Cooling it enough to truly halt its decay tends to destroy the very tissues you are trying to preserve. And no one has found a way around this for a creature as complex as a person. It remains, for now, a hope rather than a method. Another idea is, stranger still. Do not send grown people at all. Send the seeds of people, the frozen beginnings of life, to be grown into children only after the ship arrives, raised by machines on a world freshly reached. This would shrink the cargo to almost nothing and free the ship from the burden of keeping a living community alive across the dark. But it asks machines to do something no machine has ever done, to raise human children with no human hand to guide them, to teach them language and love and the whole inheritance of being human, alone, on the far side of an ocean of space. It is hard to imagine, and harder still to trust. And so we return, again and again, to the generation ship. For all its fragility, it asks for no miracle of suspended life, no machine-raised children, no technology we cannot at least imagine building. It asks only that human beings do what human beings have always done: live, have children, pass on what they know, and keep going. The difference is that they must do it sealed inside a single fragile vessel, with no world beneath them and no help anywhere, for longer than any human story has ever run unbroken. The first crew chooses to go. Every crew after them is simply born into the going. It is one of the oldest and most haunting ideas in all of science fiction, and beneath the romance of it lies a question that is brutally practical. How long could such a ship actually survive? Not in a story. in reality? How long before something breaks that cannot be fixed? How long before the air turns foul, the machines wear out, the people forget why they ever left, or simply forget how to keep themselves alive? To answer that, we have to stop imagining a sleek silver rocket and start imagining something far more honest. A generation ship is not a vehicle. It is a closed world. And closed worlds have a terrible habit of falling apart. Before we descend into all the ways such a world can fail, it helps to picture what it would actually look like. Forget the sleek arrowhead of a rocket. A generation ship would be something closer to a moving landscape. Imagine a vast cylinder, perhaps several kilometers long and a kilometer or more across, turning slowly end over end about its long axis. Step inside, and you would find yourself not in a cramped cabin, but on the inner surface of that cylinder, a curving floor that sweeps up on either side and arches overhead, so that if you looked straight up you might see fields and dwellings hanging far above you, on the opposite side of the spinning drum. The spin would press your feet to the floor, manufacturing a gentle gravity, while down the central axis, where the spin has no grip, things would drift weightless. There might be a strip of artificial light running along that axis, a glowing line standing in for the sun, brightening and dimming on a cycle to give the crew their days and nights. There might be soil, real soil, spread across the inner surface, and growing things rooted in it, and pathways winding between the dwellings and the farms. There might even be small bodies of water, ponds or streams that curl around the curving inner world, their surfaces held in place by the same spin that holds the people. It would be, in every sense that matters, a tiny world turned inside out, its sky on the inside and the cold void pressing on the outside of its walls. And every part of that world, the air above the fields, the water in the ponds, the warmth of the artificial sun, the soil itself, would be a thing the crew had to make and maintain and defend, with nothing outside but the dark. This is the truth that the romance of starflight always glosses over. A generation ship is not a journey with a few inconveniences. It is the wholesale recreation of everything a planet does for us, for free, every moment of our lives, packed into a single, fragile shell and kept running by human hands for 1,000 years. And closed worlds have a terrible habit of falling apart. Let us begin with the most immediate thing, the thing you would notice within about 4 minutes of it failing. The air. On Earth, you never think about breathing. You take a breath, you release it, and the entire planet quietly takes care of the rest. Trees and grass and vast invisible blooms of ocean, plankton drink in the carbon dioxide you exhale and hand back oxygen in return. This exchange has been running for billions of years, powered by a star 150 million kilometers away, balanced across an entire biosphere of staggering size. It is almost impossible to grasp the scale of what does this work for us. The forests of the world, the endless grasslands, the vast unseen drifting clouds of tiny plants in the surface of every ocean, all of them, every moment, drinking carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen. Trillions upon trillions of living things spread across an entire planet, performing in concert a chemical balancing act so enormous and so steady that the composition of the air has stayed breathable for longer than animals have existed. You are sustained, right now, by a machine the size of a world, and it asks nothing of you. You do not maintain it. You do not repair it. You do not even notice it. You simply breathe, and the planet takes care of the rest, as it has for every human who ever lived and every creature before them. Now, seal all of that inside a metal hull. Every person aboard a generation ship breathes in oxygen and breathes out carbon dioxide, the same as you are doing right now, but there is no planet to absorb it. There is only the machinery the crew brought with them and whatever living green things they can keep alive in the dark. If the carbon dioxide is not stripped out of the air continuously, it begins to build. It does not take much. When the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air around you climbs to just a few percent, your breathing quickens, your head begins to ache, your thoughts grow slow and muddy. Push it a little higher, and a person loses consciousness. A little higher still, and they simply do not wake. On a generation ship, the air does not forgive mistakes. A single failure in the carbon dioxide scrubbers, left unattended for a few hours, could quietly poison an entire compartment while its occupants slept. So the ship would need backups for its backups. Chemical scrubbers that bind carbon dioxide out of the air. Vast gardens of plants, pulling double duty as food and as living lungs. And almost certainly, banks of algae, simple green organisms in tanks of water, churning out oxygen with relentless efficiency in a space far smaller than a forest would need. But here is the catch that nobody escapes. Every one of those systems is made of parts. Pumps have seals that crack, filters clog, tanks corrode, plants catch diseases and die. Algae cultures can crash overnight, turning from a healthy green soup into a dead and useless sludge for reasons that are not always understood, even by the experts who study them. The atmosphere of the ship is not a thing you build once and forget. It is a thing you must defend every single day, forever, against the slow, patient pressure of entropy, trying to turn your breathable air into poison. And the people doing the defending will, after a few generations, be individuals who have never seen what real air looks like, who have never felt wind, who have only ever known the faint hum of the recyclers and the particular recycled smell of a world that has been breathing itself for 100 years. It is worth pausing on just how delicate the chemistry of breathable air really is. You might imagine that air is simple, just the stuff you pull into your lungs without thinking. But the mix has to be almost exactly right. Too little oxygen, and the crew grows sluggish and confused, their bodies starved of the fuel that every cell depends on. Too much oxygen, and something far more frightening becomes possible. In an atmosphere rich in oxygen, fire behaves like a living thing. Materials that would barely smolder in normal air can erupt into flame, and a spark that would mean nothing on Earth becomes a deadly threat in a sealed metal world where there is nowhere to run from the smoke. So the oxygen level must be held within a narrow band, neither too rich nor too thin, monitored constantly by sensors that themselves can fail, that can drift out of calibration, that can quietly begin reporting numbers that are no longer true. And it is not only oxygen and carbon dioxide that matter. A closed world slowly fills with 1,000 other things. The chemicals that leak out of plastics over the years, the gases given off by paint and adhesive and electronics as they age, the compounds released by the crew themselves, and by the plants, and by the countless invisible microbes that live alongside any human community. On Earth, all of this is diluted into an ocean of air so vast that it simply vanishes. Inside a ship, with nowhere for it to go, it accumulates. The air must be scrubbed not just of carbon dioxide, but of a slow, rising tide of trace contaminants, any one of which, allowed to build for years, could begin to sicken the people who breathe it. The atmosphere of a generation ship is therefore not a backdrop. It is a chemistry experiment that must be kept in perfect balance for 1,000 years by people who depend on it absolutely and who have never known any other sky. Think about what it would mean to grow up inside that. A child born on the ship learns very early that the air is precious, that you do not waste it, that the gentle hum of the recyclers is the sound of being alive. There would be no thunderstorms in their world, no first breath of cold morning air, no smell of rain on warm stone. There would only be the steady, filtered, faintly metallic atmosphere of home, the only home they will ever know, defended every hour of every day against the silent pressure of the void trying to leak its way inside. Now, consider water. A human being can survive only a few days without it. And on a ship, there is no rain, no rivers, no wells. There is only the water you launched with, and the water you can recover from everything that passes through a living body. Every drop of urine, every breath of humid exhaled air, every bead of sweat, every trace of moisture from cooking and washing must be captured, filtered, purified, and drunk again. The water that keeps the 100th generation alive will be, molecule for molecule, the same water that the first crew carried up from Earth. It will have passed through thousands of human bodies, through countless filters and tanks and pipes, recycled again and again across the centuries. There is nothing wrong with this in principle. The space stations we operate today already recover the overwhelming majority of their water this way, and the astronauts aboard them are perfectly healthy. But those stations are resupplied constantly, fresh shipments arriving from the planet just below them. A generation ship has no planet below. If even a small fraction of the water is lost with each cycle, lost to leaks, to chemical reactions, to the slow venting of vapor into space, through a hull that can never be perfectly sealed, then the total supply slowly, inexorably shrinks. A loss of a fraction of a percent per year sounds like nothing. Across 1,000 years, it can mean the difference between a living world and a tomb. So the engineers must aim for something close to perfection, a closed loop so tight that almost nothing ever escapes. And perfection, across deep time, is the one thing no machine has ever delivered. Consider the journey of a single glass of water aboard such a ship. You drink it. Your body uses what it needs and releases the rest, some as moisture in your breath, some as sweat, some as waste. The humid air you exhale is drawn into the recyclers, where the moisture is condensed back into liquid. The waste is collected and run through filters so fine that they strip out everything but the water itself. Every trace is gathered, cleaned, tested, and returned to the supply, ready to be drunk again by you, or by someone else, or by your great-great-grandchild a century from now. There is something almost beautiful about it, and something almost unbearable. The same water, cycling endlessly through bodies and machines, never lost, never wasted, never resting. On Earth, water moves through a grand cycle too, rising from the oceans, falling as rain, flowing down rivers back to the sea, purified at every step by the sheer scale of the planet. But that cycle is powered by the sun and balanced across an entire world. The ship must perform the same miracle inside its hull, with a fraction of the room and none of the margin. And the machines that do it are not gentle. They run hot, they run hard, and they run without pause. The filters foul and must be cleaned or replaced. The pumps wear at their seals. The pipes, carrying water that has been chemically treated again and again, can corrode from the inside, springing slow leaks in places no one can easily reach. Even the water itself can turn against the crew. In a closed system, bacteria can take hold in the pipes and tanks, forming slick invisible films that resist cleaning and can contaminate the entire supply. A single failure of sanitation could spread sickness through the whole population in a matter of days, with no fresh water to flush the system and no outside source to draw from. So the water must be watched as carefully as the air, tested constantly, treated relentlessly, guarded against both loss and corruption with a vigilance that can never relax. And always, in the background, the slow arithmetic of leakage. No hull is perfectly sealed. No system recovers every drop. Somewhere, always, a little moisture is escaping into space, vanishing forever into the void. And the total supply ticks down by a fraction too small to notice in any single year, but impossible to ignore across 1,000. Then there is food. And food may be the hardest problem of them all. You cannot pack a 1,000-year lunch. No amount of stored rations could feed a growing population for that long without rotting, without running out, without crushing the ship under its own weight before it ever left orbit. The ship must grow its own food, which means the ship must carry, inside its hull, a working farm. And a farm is not a simple thing. It is an entire web of living relationships, soil and microbes and pollinators and nutrients and light, all balanced in a way that took the Earth billions of years to perfect. To recreate even a fragment of that inside a spinning metal drum is one of the most fiendishly difficult engineering tasks anyone has ever imagined. Crops need light, so the ship must pour enormous amounts of energy into artificial suns glowing over the fields. Crops need nutrients, so every scrap of waste, every fallen leaf, every body that returns to the soil at the end of a life must be broken down and fed back into the cycle. Nothing can be thrown away, because there is no away. There is no landfill in deep space. There is no ocean to dump into. There is no atmosphere to vent into, no distant corner of a continent to bury things in, no river to carry waste away out of sight and out of mind. On Earth, the word away has always been a comforting illusion, a way of pretending that the things we discard simply cease to exist, when in truth, they only travel somewhere we no longer have to look. On a generation ship, the illusion collapses entirely. There is no somewhere else. Every atom the crew possesses remains aboard, whether it is part of a meal, a machine, a body, or a heap of waste. And the only question is whether that atom can be cleaned and returned to use, or whether it is lost to them forever inside the closed walls of their world. Every atom of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus that the crew brought with them is all the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus they will ever have. A generation ship is the ultimate expression of recycling, taken to its absolute and unforgiving extreme. And the danger here is subtle, because a farm can fail in ways that are slow and quiet. A blight could sweep through a crop. A pest, accidentally carried aboard at launch, could escape into the fields and find no natural predators to keep it in check. The delicate balance of soil chemistry could drift, year by year, until the plants no longer thrive. The crew might find, 3 centuries into the voyage, that the wheat will no longer grow, and that nobody alive remembers exactly why, because the people who understood the original system have been gone for 200 years. There is a deeper subtlety here that makes the farming problem even more daunting. A field on Earth is not just plants and dirt, it is a living community of staggering complexity. Beneath the soil, countless microbes break down dead matter and free up the nutrients that plants need to grow. Earthworms churn the earth. Fungi weave invisible threads between the roots, trading minerals for sugar in a partnership older than animals. Above the soil, insects pollinate the flowers, and predators keep the pests in check, and the whole thing balances itself through a web of relationships so intricate that no scientist fully understands it, even today. To carry that aboard a ship, you cannot simply pack soil and seeds. You have to carry the entire living web, or build a substitute for it, and keep that web alive and balanced for 1,000 years. Every species you bring depends on others. Remove the wrong microbe, and the soil slowly dies. Lose the pollinators, and the crops bear no fruit. Let a single pest slip through with no predator to control it, and an entire harvest can be devoured before anyone understands what is happening. Some designs try to escape this trap by growing food without soil at all, in trays of nutrient-rich water, or in mists of carefully measured chemicals sprayed directly onto bare roots. These methods can be astonishingly efficient, producing huge amounts of food in a small space, with every nutrient precisely controlled. But they trade one fragility for another. A soil-based farm is forgiving and slow to fail, buffered by the vast reserves locked in the earth itself. A farm grown in water and chemicals is fast and productive, but utterly dependent on its machinery. Cut the power to the pumps, foul the nutrient mix, let a disease into the water, and the entire crop can collapse within hours, far faster than soil ever would. There is no perfect answer. Every choice trades one kind of danger for another, and the crew must live with whichever danger they chose, generation after generation, with no way to start over. And then there is the simple matter of variety. A human being cannot live on one crop alone. The body needs a whole spectrum of nutrients, drawn from many different foods, and a diet too narrow leads slowly to sickness, to weakness, to the strange deficiency diseases that haunted sailors on the long voyages of the past. So, the ship must grow not one crop but dozens, each with its own needs, its own light and water and temperature, its own vulnerabilities, all balanced inside the same finite space. And it must do this while also producing protein, which means perhaps fish in tanks, or insects raised for food, or vats of cultured cells grown without any animal at all. Every one of these adds another living system to maintain, another delicate balance to defend, another way for the whole fragile structure of survival to come undone. The farm, in the end, is not a feature of the ship. It is the ship's beating heart, and if it falters, everything else falters with it. This is the shadow that falls across everything aboard a generation ship. It is not just a problem of machines. It is a problem of memory. Knowledge has to survive the journey just as much as the people do. And knowledge, it turns out, is shockingly easy to lose. Think about how much of what keeps you alive today you do not actually understand. You flip a switch and light appears, but could you build the power plant that makes it? You drink clean water from a tap, but could you engineer the system that purifies it? You are kept alive by an enormous web of expertise spread across millions of specialists, and no single human holds more than a sliver of it. Now imagine compressing all of that expertise, every skill needed to keep a closed world breathing and fed and powered, into a population of perhaps a few thousand people. And then imagine that population having to teach all of it, perfectly, to the next generation, and the next, and the next, for 1,000 years. In a society on Earth, when knowledge is lost, you can usually relearn it, because the raw world is still there to experiment on, and there are billions of other people to learn from. On a generation ship, there is no margin. If the only crew member who truly understands the reactor passes away before training a replacement, that knowledge is simply gone, and the ship cannot pull over to ask for directions. It cannot send away for a manual. It cannot wait while someone reinvents nuclear engineering from first principles. The lights might already be dimming by the time anyone realizes how much they have forgotten. And knowledge does not only have to be remembered, it has to be understood. There is a vast difference between knowing the steps to fix a machine and understanding why those steps work. A crew that has merely memorized the instructions can follow them perfectly, right up until the moment something happens that the instructions never anticipated. And then they are lost, because they do not grasp the principles beneath the procedure, the deep reasons why the system behaves the way it does. Real understanding is fragile in a way that rote memory is not. It lives in the connections a mind makes, in the intuition built up over years of working with a thing, in the ability to improvise when the unexpected arrives. That kind of understanding is desperately hard to teach, and even harder to preserve across generations who will never see the world the knowledge originally came from. How do you teach someone to understand an ocean when they have never seen water move? How do you teach the feel of weather, the behavior of fire, the thousand intuitions that the original engineers absorbed simply by growing up on a planet to children who have only ever known a sealed metal world? So the ship would need more than libraries. It would need teachers, and teachers of teachers, an unbroken chain of human minds passing not just facts but genuine comprehension from one generation to the next. And every link in that chain is a point of failure. A single generation that learns sloppily, that takes shortcuts, that loses interest in the hard disciplines because the ship seems to be running fine, could break the chain forever. The danger is greatest precisely when things are going well. When the systems hum along without trouble for decades, it becomes easy to believe they will always hum along. The pressure to study, to train, to truly master the workings of the ship quietly fades. Why spend years learning the deep theory of the reactor when it has not given any trouble in living memory? And so the knowledge thins, generation by generation, not through any dramatic loss but through simple neglect, until the day the reactor finally does falter and the crew discovers that the last person who truly understood it is 3 generations in the grave. You could try to guard against this by writing everything down, by building vast archives of every fact and procedure and principle the original crew possessed. But archives are only as useful as the people who can read and understand them. A library full of knowledge nobody can interpret is just a tomb of words. And across 1,000 years, even the way people think and learn and make sense of information can change beyond recognition, until the careful manuals of the founders read like the riddles of a vanished civilization. We have seen this happen on Earth, again and again. The knowledge of how to build certain ancient structures was lost for centuries, the techniques forgotten so completely that later peoples gazed at the works of their own ancestors and could not imagine how they had been made. Whole languages have died, taking with them every thought ever written in them, every story, every piece of practical wisdom, leaving behind marks that no living person can read. And these losses happened on a planet full of people, where the knowledge existed in many places at once, and could often be rediscovered or pieced back together from fragments. On a generation ship, there are no other places. There is no other library, no other city, no rival community that kept a copy of what was lost. There is only the one ship, the one population, the one fragile thread of memory, and if it frays, there is nothing anywhere to mend it from. The founders might try to guard against this with every tool they can imagine, recording their knowledge in the most durable forms, building teaching into the daily life of the ship, designing the machines to be as understandable as possible. But they cannot reach forward across the centuries to correct their descendants. They cannot make the future generations care or study or remember. They can only set the chain in motion and hope that each link holds, knowing that they will be long gone before the first weak link is ever tested. This is the quiet terror at the center of the whole idea, not an explosion, not a sudden catastrophe, but forgetting. The slow, soft, almost invisible erosion of the knowledge that keeps a closed world alive, happening so gradually that no single generation notices, until one day the ship is full of people surrounded by machines they can no longer fully understand, riding through the dark on the fading competence of the dead. This is sometimes called the problem of cultural drift, and it may be the quiet thing that kills a generation ship long before any machine does. Across enough centuries, languages change. The crew who launched the ship might speak in a way that their distant descendants can barely understand. The way the English of 1,000 years ago is nearly a foreign tongue to us today. Beliefs change. The original mission, the very reason for the voyage, could curdle into myth or be forgotten, or be actively rejected by descendants who never agreed to be born into a flying prison aimed at a star they will never reach. This raises one of the most uncomfortable questions at the heart of the entire idea. The first crew chose to go, but what about everyone after them? Each child born aboard the ship is born without consent into a life of profound limitation. They cannot leave. They cannot choose another path. Their entire existence, their work, their relationships, even the number of children they are permitted to have, may all be dictated by the cold arithmetic of keeping the ship alive. A generation ship is not just an engineering project. It is a multi-century social experiment with no exit and no second chance if it goes wrong. The question of consent runs deeper than it first appears, and it is one of the genuinely uncomfortable things about the whole idea, impossible to engineer away. The first crew are volunteers. They weigh the cost, they understand the sacrifice. They choose to give their lives to a journey they will never complete, perhaps for the sake of an idea, or a hope, or the survival of something larger than themselves. That is their right, and there is something noble in it. But their children did not choose. And their children's children did not choose. By the time the ship is a few generations into its voyage, every single person aboard was born into a life of profound constraint that none of them ever agreed to. They cannot leave. They cannot opt out. They cannot decide that the journey was a mistake and turn the ship around, because the ship cannot turn around, and even if it could, there would be nothing to return to that any of them ever knew. Their work may be assigned by the needs of the ship rather than the desires of their hearts. The number of children they may have might be strictly limited, because a closed world cannot allow its population to grow beyond what its farms and recyclers can support. Even the most personal choices of their lives might be shaped or constrained or outright dictated by the cold requirements of survival in a sealed vessel. Is it right to bring people into existence under such conditions? To create human beings whose entire lives are bounded by walls they never chose, aimed at a destination they will never reach, in service of a mission decided by ancestors they never met? There is no easy answer. Some would say that all of us are born without consent, into circumstances we did not choose, that none of us picked our parents or our country or our era, and that life aboard a ship is no different in kind, only in degree. Others would say that there is a vast moral difference between the ordinary, unchosen circumstances of life on a whole open planet and the deliberate creation of human beings inside a sealed box with no possibility of escape, knowing in advance the narrow life they will be forced to live. This is not a problem that better technology can solve. No improvement in recyclers or reactors or shielding can answer the question of whether it is right to commit unborn generations to a journey they cannot refuse. It is a question about what we owe to people who do not yet exist, and it sits at the very center of the dream of the generation ship, refusing to be set aside. A generation ship is not just an engineering project. It is a multi-century social experiment with no exit and no second chance if it goes wrong. And history on Earth, where escape is always at least theoretically possible, is full of closed communities that turned inward, that fractured, that fell into conflict or tyranny or collapse. Now, remove the escape entirely. Remove the open sky, the option to walk away, the simple knowledge that there is a wider world somewhere out there. What happens to human beings raised for generations inside a sealed metal tube with nowhere to go and nothing to see beyond the same corridors their grandparents walked. We genuinely do not know. No one has ever tried it. The longest any group of humans has lived in true isolation, cut off entirely from the rest of the species, is far shorter than the journey would demand, and even those experiments showed strange and powerful psychological strains. A generation ship would be asking its passengers to do something no human community has ever done. To hold a society together, intact and functional and sane, for longer than most civilizations on Earth have ever lasted. There is also the raw question of numbers. How many people do you need to start such a voyage? Too few, and the community is fragile in a different way. A small population is vulnerable to the slow drift of its own genetics, as the same family lines intermarry again and again across the generations, with no fresh blood ever arriving from outside. Over enough centuries, harmful traits can accumulate, and the diversity that keeps a population healthy can quietly wither. To avoid this, the founding crew would need to be large enough and carefully chosen enough to carry a rich enough variety of human heredity to last 1,000 years without collapse. Estimates for the minimum size vary, but they are not small. You are not sending a handful of explorers. You are sending a town, perhaps several thousand strong, a population large enough to remain genetically healthy, to fill every role the ship requires, and to absorb the inevitable losses of any long human story without dwindling toward extinction. There is a delicate balance to be struck in that number, and getting it wrong in either direction is fatal. Send too few, and the bloodlines narrow, the genetic variety withers, and across the generations the population grows fragile, prone to inherited weakness, vulnerable to the slow decline that haunts any group too small and too closed. Send too many, and the ship must be larger, heavier, hungrier, demanding more air and water and food and energy, more farmland, more living space, more of everything, until the cost of accelerating it all to a useful speed becomes impossible. The founders must thread the needle, choosing a number large enough for health and small enough for the ship to carry, and then they must keep the population near that number for 1,000 years, neither letting it grow beyond what the ship can feed nor letting it shrink toward collapse. This means the most intimate matters of human life, who has children and how many, would have to be managed with a care that no free society on Earth has ever accepted. A closed world cannot allow its numbers to surge, because there is no extra food, no extra air, no room for a population that doubles unchecked. Nor can it allow them to dwindle, because too few people cannot run the ship or carry the heredity of the species forward. The crew would live their entire lives inside this constraint. The size of their families shaped not by their own desires alone, but by the cold capacity of the world that carries them, a limit as absolute and unforgiving as the walls of the hull itself. And every one of those several thousand people must be fed, watered, housed, kept in breathable air, and given something to do with their lives that feels worth doing. That last part is not a small thing. Human beings need more than survival. They need purpose, meaning, a reason to rise each morning that is larger than simply keeping the machinery running. On Earth, that meaning comes from 1,000 sources, from the open future, from the endless variety of the world, from the simple knowledge that you could, if you chose, walk in any direction toward an unknown horizon. Aboard a generation ship, the horizon is a wall. The future is fixed. Every direction leads back to the same corridors, the same faces, the same recycled air. For the founding crew, this might be bearable, because they chose it, because they remember the world they left and feel the weight of the mission they accepted. But for those born aboard, who chose nothing, who remember no other life, the meaning of it all is far less certain. Why keep the ship alive? Why endure the discipline, the limits, the endless, careful work for a destination they will never reach, chosen by ancestors they never knew, for reasons that may no longer make any sense to them at all? A generation ship does not just have to solve the problem of keeping bodies alive, it has to solve the far harder problem of keeping a reason to live alive, across centuries, in people who never agreed to the journey in the first place. This is perhaps the deepest design challenge of them all, and it cannot be met with any machine. You can engineer a recycler that scrubs the air. You cannot engineer meaning. You cannot build a device that makes a person born in the 300th year of the voyage care about an arrival they will never see, chosen by ancestors they will never know. That sense of purpose has to be grown and tended and passed down as carefully as any crop by every generation in turn. How would they do it? Perhaps through ritual, through ceremonies marking the milestones of the voyage, the crossing of the halfway point, the passing of each century, the remembrance of the founders who chose to go. Perhaps through story, the great narrative of the journey, told and retold until it became the central myth of the entire community, the thing that gave their confined lives a shape and a direction. Perhaps through the simple dignity of work that matters, the knowledge that every person aboard was needed, that the survival of the whole world rested on each of them doing their part. A society that could sustain meaning across 1,000 years of confinement would be as much an achievement as the ship itself, perhaps more. Because the ship's machinery, however complex, obeys fixed laws and can be repaired with the right tools and knowledge. The human heart obeys no such laws, and a generation that loses its reason to continue cannot simply be fixed. It is here, more than anywhere, that the dream of the generation ship reveals its true difficulty. It is not, in the end, mainly a problem of engineering. It is a problem of being human, of holding a community together, of keeping hope alive in the dark, of passing not just life, but the will to live across a gulf of time that no single life can span. And history offers little comfort here. Closed communities on Earth, even small ones, even short-lived ones, have a long record of turning strange. Isolation breeds suspicion, rigid hierarchies, the splintering of groups into rivals. Power, once seized, is rarely surrendered, and the smaller and more enclosed the world, the more these pressures intensify, until disputes that would mean little in a vast society become matters of survival in a sealed one. Now stretch that across 40 generations, with no escape valve, no frontier to absorb the restless, no outside authority to appeal to when things go wrong. The ship would need a way to govern itself that could remain stable and just across a span longer than any government in human history has ever endured. We have never built such a thing. Every system of rule our species has ever devised has eventually fallen, fractured, or transformed beyond recognition. To ask one to survive intact for 1,000 years, in the most claustrophobic conditions imaginable, is to ask for something genuinely unprecedented in the human story. Let us step back outside the hull for a moment and look at the ship from the cold perspective of physics, because the dangers inside are matched by dangers without. Deep space is not empty. It only looks empty. In reality, it is filled with radiation, a constant invisible sleet of high-energy particles streaming from the sun, from distant exploding stars, from the violent depths of the galaxy itself. And there is the matter of isolation, a loneliness deeper than anything humans have ever experienced. As the ship pulls away from the solar system, the most fundamental connection of all begins to stretch and fade. Communication. A message sent home travels at the speed of light, the same limit that binds everything in the universe. In the early days of the voyage, when the ship is still close, a message might reach Earth in hours, and a reply might come back the same day. But the ship is always moving outward, and the gap is always growing. Soon, a message takes days to arrive, then weeks, then years. By the time the ship is well into its journey, a question sent to Earth might not receive an answer until everyone who asked it has grown old or passed away entirely. A conversation becomes impossible. There can be no asking for help, no calling home for advice, no comfort of a voice from the world left behind, because by the time any voice could answer, the moment that needed it is centuries gone. The crew is alone, in a way no human community has ever been alone. Not merely far from help, but cut off from the very possibility of timely help. Sealed into their tiny world with only each other and the machines in the dark. And as the centuries pass, even the meaning of home begins to fade. The founders left a living Earth, a world of billions, and they carried memories of it. Stories of oceans and forests and cities and crowds. But their distant descendants never knew that world. To them, Earth is not a memory, but a legend, a place spoken of by the dead, perhaps no more real to them than a story of a paradise across an uncrossable sea. They might wonder if it still exists at all. 1,000 years is long enough for a civilization to rise or fall, and the crew of a generation ship, cut off from all timely news, might travel onward for centuries, with no way of knowing whether the world that launched them still stood, or whether they were the last fragment of humanity left anywhere, carrying the entire future of the species inside one fragile turning drum. In reality, the space they travel through is filled with radiation, a constant invisible sleet of high-energy particles streaming from the sun, from distant exploding stars, from the violent depths of the galaxy itself. On Earth, you are shielded from almost all of this. Our planet's magnetic field deflects the charged particles, and the thick blanket of the atmosphere absorbs the rest, so that by the time the radiation reaches the ground, it has been gentled into something life can endure. A generation ship has no planet-sized magnetic field. It has no atmosphere stretching kilometers above it. It has only its hull, and whatever shielding the crew can carry. The most dangerous particles of all are something called cosmic rays. These are atomic nuclei, accelerated to nearly the speed of light by the most violent events in the universe. When one of them strikes the hull of a ship, it can shatter into a spray of secondary particles, and those particles can tear through living tissue, breaking apart the delicate molecules of life, damaging the genetic code inside every cell they pass through. To understand how relentless this assault is, picture the body not as a solid thing, but as an unimaginably intricate arrangement of molecules, each one performing a precise task, the whole orchestra of life depending on every instrument staying in tune. Now imagine a particle moving at nearly the speed of light passing straight through that orchestra, knocking molecules apart as it goes, leaving a trail of microscopic wreckage in its wake. Most of the time, the body repairs the damage almost instantly, for it has spent billions of years evolving ways to mend itself. But the repairs are not perfect, and they do not always keep pace. When the damage falls on the genetic code, the master instructions inside each cell, an error can slip through uncorrected, a tiny corruption in the blueprint of life. A single such error is usually harmless, but across years of constant bombardment, the errors accumulate, and some of them, in the wrong place, can set a cell on the path toward becoming a cancer. This is the slow danger of deep space radiation. Not a sudden blow, but a gradual erosion, a steady raising of the odds that something will eventually go wrong inside the body, year after year, for the whole length of a life spent beyond the protection of a planet. Over years, this damage accumulates. It raises the risk of cancer. It can harm the brain and the nervous system. And most troubling of all, for a generation ship, it can damage the cells that pass life on to the next generation, raising the specter of accumulating genetic harm passed down through the descendants. To shield against cosmic rays, you need mass, and a great deal of it. Thick walls of water or rock, or simply piled up stored material wrapped around the living spaces like armor. But mass is the enemy of any spacecraft. Every additional ton of shielding is another ton that must be accelerated up to cruising speed and slowed down again at the destination, at staggering cost in energy. The engineers are caught in a vice. Too little shielding, and the crew slowly accumulates harm across the generations. Too much, and the ship becomes too heavy to ever get up to a useful speed at all. There is a clever idea that might ease this trap, and it is one of the few places where the ship's own needs come to its rescue. The water the crew must carry for drinking, the food stores, even the waste they cannot yet recycle. All of it is mass, and mass is exactly what stops radiation. So the living quarters might be wrapped in the ship's own water tanks, in its food reserves, in everything it already needs to carry anyway, turning the supplies of life into a shield against the rays of death. The sleeping quarters, where the crew spends a third of every day, might sit at the very heart of the ship, buried deepest behind the thickest layers, so that at least during rest, the body has its best protection. But even the cleverest shielding cannot stop everything. The most energetic cosmic rays are so powerful that no practical amount of material can fully absorb them. And worse, when these particles strike shielding that is too thin, they can shatter it into a spray of secondary particles, so that a poorly designed shield can actually make the radiation worse, scattering one deadly ray into a shower of many. The engineers must walk a knife edge, choosing materials and thicknesses with great care, because the wrong choice does not merely fail to protect. It can amplify the very thing it was meant to stop. And there is a special danger that comes not steadily but in sudden, violent bursts. Our sun, calm as it usually seems, sometimes erupts. It hurls out enormous storms of charged particles, vast clouds of radiation that sweep outward through space at tremendous speed. A ship caught in such a storm without warning, without a heavily shielded refuge to flee to, could see its crew receive a dose of radiation in a few hours that would normally take years to accumulate. So the ship would need a storm shelter, a small, heavily armored room into which the entire crew could crowd when the warning came, riding out the worst of the radiation behind walls, thick enough to blunt even a solar tempest. Imagine the alarm sounding, perhaps in the middle of what passes for night aboard the ship, and the whole population, hundreds or thousands of people, moving with practiced calm toward the shielded heart of the vessel, gathering together in the one place built to keep them safe, waiting out the invisible storm raging against the hull, and then returning to their lives once the danger had passed. It would become a part of their existence, these gatherings in the shelter, a ritual repeated across the generations, a reminder woven into daily life that the dark they traveled through was never truly safe. For generation after generation, the crew would live with this knowledge, that the void they travel through is not merely empty and cold, but actively hostile, raining invisible harm upon them every second, that their very cells are under perpetual assault, and that only the thin, patient discipline of their shielding stands between their descendants and a slow accumulation of damage passed down the bloodline. And then there is the problem of impacts. The space between the stars is not perfectly empty. It is sparsely scattered with dust, with tiny grains of rock and ice, and even with individual atoms drifting alone in the void. At rest, none of this would matter. A grain of dust floating in space is a harmless thing, smaller than a speck you would brush from your sleeve without a thought. But the ship is not at rest. It is moving at a tremendous speed, and speed changes everything. When two things meet at a great velocity, the energy of the collision depends not just on their size, but on how fast they are closing, and at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light. Even the tiniest grain carries a shocking amount of energy, because that energy climbs steeply as the speed rises. A mote of dust that would be nothing at walking pace becomes, at interstellar speed, a tiny bomb. At the speeds a generation ship would need to travel, even a speck of dust the size of a grain of sand carries the energy of a small explosion. Striking the hull at a fraction of the speed of light, that tiny grain becomes a weapon, punching into the metal, vaporizing on impact, sending a shockwave through the structure. A single larger object, a pebble, a chip of ancient ice, could be catastrophic, tearing a hole that vents the precious air into the void in seconds. So the front of the ship would need to be armored, a thick shield facing the direction of travel, designed to absorb the endless rain of microscopic collisions over centuries of flight. And it would need to repair itself, or be repaired, again and again, as the relentless sandblasting of interstellar space slowly wore it down. Picture the front of that vessel after 500 years of travel, pitted, scarred, eroded grain by grain, like a stone on a beach worn smooth by the tide. Except the tide here is the galaxy itself, and it never stops. There is another force, or rather, the absence of one, that would shape life aboard the ship in ways easy to overlook: gravity. On Earth, gravity is so constant that we never notice it, yet our bodies are built around it utterly. Our bones grow strong because they must bear our weight. Our muscles stay firm because they fight against the pull of the planet with every step. Our hearts pump against it, our inner ears balance with it. Our entire form has been sculpted by billions of years of evolution under its steady downward call. Take it away, and the body begins to unravel. The astronauts who spend months in weightlessness return to Earth weakened, their bones thinned, their muscles wasted, their hearts grown lazy, their sense of balance scrambled. After only a year without gravity, the human body is noticeably diminished. Now, imagine a lifetime. Imagine being born in weightlessness, growing up never knowing the pull of a world, your bones never asked to bear weight, your muscles never asked to push against anything. Such a person might never be able to stand on a planet at all, their body too frail for the very gravity their distant destination would demand. A generation born in true weightlessness might arrive at a new world physically incapable of living on it. So a generation ship cannot simply drift through space in freefall. It must somehow create its own gravity, and the only practical way we know to do that is to spin. Set a great wheel turning, and anything inside its rim is pressed outward against the wall, and that outward press feels, to a body standing on it, almost exactly like the pull of a planet. The ship would have to be a spinning thing, a vast rotating drum or ring, its inhabitants living on the inside of the outer wall, with the spin itself manufacturing the weight their bodies need to stay strong. But spinning a ship brings its own strangeness. The pull is only convincing if the wheel is large. A small spinning ship would press your feet to the floor while leaving your head in noticeably weaker gravity, and the slightest movement would tug at your inner ear in dizzying, sickening ways. To feel natural, the wheel must be enormous, turning slowly and majestically, kilometers across, so that the difference from your feet to your head becomes too small to notice, and the spin must never stop. If the great wheel were ever to slow or seize, every person aboard would suddenly find their artificial gravity fading away, their world tilting into weightlessness, the careful illusion of a planet dissolving around them. The bearings that let it turn, the mechanisms that keep it spinning true, become yet another system that must run flawlessly for 1,000 years, another beating part of a machine that can never be allowed to rest. Now, let us talk about the single greatest engineering challenge of all, the thing that everything else depends on: power. To run the air recyclers, to light the farms, to purify the water, to maintain the temperature, to operate the computers and the medical systems and the workshops, a generation ship would need an enormous and utterly reliable supply of energy, flowing without interruption, for centuries. There is no sunlight worth speaking of in the deep dark between the stars. The sun, by then, would be just another point of light, no brighter than any other star in the sky. Solar panels, which power our spacecraft near home, would be useless out there. The ship would have to carry its own star, in the form of a nuclear reactor, or perhaps several of them, generating power by splitting heavy atoms, or, if the technology could ever be made to work, by fusing light ones together the way the sun itself does. A reactor that runs for 1,000 years. Think about what that demands. We have never built a machine of any kind that has run continuously for even a tenth of that span. Every reactor needs fuel, and fuel runs out. Every reactor needs cooling, and cooling systems fail. Every reactor produces waste, and waste must be stored or processed. And the components themselves, bathed in radiation and heat year after year, grow brittle and degrade until they must be replaced by a crew who must somehow keep the entire ship powered while they perform open-heart surgery on its beating core. The margin for error is razor thin. If the power fails completely, even for a short time, the consequences cascade with terrifying speed. The recyclers stop, and the air begins to spoil. The heaters stop, and the temperature begins to plunge toward the brutal cold of space, which hovers far below the freezing point of everything a human body needs. It is worth dwelling on that cold, because it is one of the strangest and most relentless enemies the ship would face. The space between the stars is among the coldest places that exists, a darkness so far from any sun that the temperature sinks to within a whisper of the absolute limit of cold itself, the point beyond which nothing can grow any colder. A human body exposed to it would lose its warmth with terrifying speed. And the ship, for all its size, is a small, warm thing adrift in an ocean of that cold, constantly bleeding its heat outward through every surface, every window, every seam in the hull. To stay alive, the crew must replace that lost warmth without pause, pouring energy into heating the air, the water, the very walls, fighting a battle against the cold that, like every other battle aboard, can never be won permanently but only held, day after day, forever. And here the ship faces a delicate paradox. The reactor at its heart produces heat in abundance, more than enough to keep everyone warm. The danger is not too little heat, but managing the flow of it, carrying warmth to where it is needed while casting the excess out into the void, all in perfect balance. Let the balance tip one way, and the ship overheats, its systems straining, its crew sweltering. Let it tip the other, and the cold of space begins to seep inward, the temperature falling, the water threatening to freeze in the pipes, the crops dying in fields gone suddenly frigid. The temperature of the entire world must be held steady, neither too hot nor too cold, by machines that themselves generate heat and must be cooled, in a balance so intricate that it must be watched and adjusted continuously across the whole length of the voyage. The lights over the farms go dark, and the crops begin to die. A generation ship that loses its power is a ship on a timer, with only hours, perhaps days, before the cold and the bad air finish what the darkness began. This is why power is not just one system among many. It is the foundation beneath every other system, the single thread from which the entire fragile structure of survival hangs. The air recyclers need power to run. The water purifiers need power. The farms need power for their artificial suns. The heaters need power to hold back the cold. The spin of the great wheel may need power to maintain. Even the computers that watch over all of it, that catch the first signs of trouble, that warn the crew when something begins to fail, run on the same precious current. Cut the power, and you do not lose one system. You lose all of them at once, in a cascade that begins the moment the lights flicker and grows worse with every passing hour. So the heart of the ship would have to be a marvel of reliability beyond anything our species has yet built. The most likely answer, with the physics we understand today, is the nuclear reactor, a machine that wrings energy from the very nuclei of atoms, releasing the colossal forces that bind the universe together. A reactor needs no sunlight, no air, no fuel that must be constantly delivered. A relatively small amount of nuclear fuel can release staggering quantities of energy, enough, in principle, to keep a city-sized ship alive for a very long time. But a reactor is not a thing you can simply switch on and walk away from. It is a controlled inferno, a continuous nuclear reaction held in delicate balance, producing not only energy but intense heat and dangerous radiation that must be managed every second. The heat must be carried away, or the reactor would melt itself. In space, there is a cruel irony hidden in this. The void is bitterly cold, but it is also a near-perfect insulator because there is nothing out there to carry heat away. Heat cannot simply drain into empty space the way it drains into cold air or cold water on Earth. The only way to shed heat in the vacuum is to radiate it away as infrared light. And that requires enormous panels, great glowing fins stretching out from the ship, slowly bleeding its waste heat into the dark. A ship running a powerful reactor for 1,000 years would have to manage a constant, delicate flow of heat, generating it in the core, carrying it through the systems that need it, and finally casting the excess away into space, all without ever letting the balance tip too far in either direction. Too little cooling, and the core overheats toward disaster. Too much, and the ship freezes. And the reactor, like everything else, ages. The intense radiation inside it slowly damages the very materials it is made of, making metals brittle, weakening structures, until parts that were strong at launch grow fragile and must be replaced. Replacing the core of a working reactor in deep space, generations into a voyage, with no spare ship to retreat to, is one of the most dangerous tasks imaginable, and yet, across 1,000 years, it might have to be done many times over. There is a more wondrous possibility, the one that powers the stars themselves. Instead of splitting heavy atoms apart, you fuse light ones together, forcing the nuclei of hydrogen to merge into helium and unleashing energy in the same process that makes the sun shine. Fusion would be cleaner, its fuel more abundant, its potential almost limitless. But we have never managed to build a fusion reactor that produces more energy than it consumes for any sustained length of time. It remains one of the great unsolved challenges of physics, a prize chased for generations and not yet won. To build a fusion reactor that could run reliably for 1,000 years in deep space would require mastery of the technology far beyond anything we possess today. Perhaps one day it will come. Perhaps the ship of the future will carry a tamed star in its belly, a small sun that never sets, pouring out the energy of life for century after century. But that day is not today. And until it arrives, the dream of an enduring power source for a 1,000-year voyage remains exactly that, a dream. So every critical system must have a backup, and the backup must have a backup. And somewhere in the design, there must be a way to limp along on emergency power long enough to fix whatever broke. The ship is, in a sense, a patient in permanent intensive care, kept alive only by constant intervention, never able to simply coast. And all of this, every pump and panel and reactor and recycler, must keep working not for a year, not for a decade, but for a span of time so long that empires rise and fall within it. This brings us to the deepest and most unforgiving problem of all, the one that underlies every other: time, deep time. The simple, grinding, unstoppable accumulation of years. We are very good at building things that last a little while. We are very bad at building things that last forever. Look around at the oldest machines human beings have ever made, and almost none of them still function. The great structures of the ancient world survive only as ruins, their moving parts long since rusted into nothing. Even the most carefully maintained machines need constant attention, replacement parts, skilled hands to keep them running. Think of the oldest working machine you can name. A clock, perhaps, that has ticked for a few hundred years in some ancient tower, and even that has been rebuilt, its worn parts replaced, its mechanism tended by generation after generation of careful hands. Nothing we have ever built runs untouched for centuries. Everything we make begins to fail almost the moment it is finished, and only constant repair holds the failure at bay. The bridge needs repainting against rust. The engine needs new parts, as the old ones wear. The building needs its roof renewed, its foundations watched, its cracks sealed before they spread. We live surrounded by this endless quiet maintenance, mostly without noticing it. Because on Earth, there is always a supply of new parts, new materials, new skilled people to do the work. Now, strip all of that away. The generation ship must maintain itself with no outside supply of anything, for a span 10 times longer than the oldest working machines we possess. It is not enough to build it well. No matter how well it is built, every component within it has a lifespan, and across 1,000 years, every single one of those lifespans will be exceeded many times over. The hull will fatigue, the wiring will degrade. The seals will harden and crack, the moving parts will wear down. The electronics, those most delicate of all our creations, will fail in their thousands, struck by radiation, worn by heat, undone by the simple passage of time. Every one of them must be either replaceable or repairable, and the ship must carry the means to do the replacing and repairing entirely on its own. This is why the generation ship must be, at its core, a self-sustaining workshop, a tiny industrial civilization in miniature. It must be able to take a broken part, break it down to its raw material, and forge it anew. It must be able to fashion a replacement for almost anything, from the smallest fastener to the largest beam, using only the materials already aboard and the energy of its reactor. It must carry the tools to make tools, and the knowledge to use them, and the people skilled enough to keep the whole chain of making alive. In a sense, the ship must reproduce within itself a slice of everything that took human civilization thousands of years to develop: the metallurgy, the chemistry, the manufacturing, the craft, all compressed into a few thousand people and a finite store of material, and all of it sustained without interruption for 10 centuries. There has never been anything like it. The closest thing we have is the Earth itself, and even the Earth resupplies itself constantly, drawing fresh material from its own vast depths, recycling its air and water through systems the size of a planet. The ship must do the same, but in a space smaller than a single city, with a population smaller than a single town, and a margin for error of essentially zero. Even the most carefully maintained machines need constant attention, replacement parts, skilled hands to keep them running. A generation ship asks for something close to the impossible. It asks for a machine that can survive a journey longer than the entire history of most human civilizations. Every weld, every wire, every seal, every circuit must either last that long or be replaceable along the way. And replacement means manufacturing. The ship cannot simply carry a spare of everything, because that would mean carrying, in essence, an entire second ship in pieces, and a third, and a fourth. Instead, the ship must be able to make its own parts. It must carry workshops, raw materials, the ability to melt down what is broken and forge it anew. It must be, in effect, a tiny self-contained industrial civilization, capable of producing everything it needs to keep itself alive, from the smallest screw to the largest structural beam. And it must do this with a finite store of raw material, recycling the same metal over and over, the same plastics, the same precious rare elements, never able to mine more, never able to order a delivery. Every time a part is melted down and reforged, a little is lost. A little oxidizes. A little is ground away as dust and cannot be recovered. Across 1,000 years, even these tiny losses add up, and the ship slowly runs low on the very stuff it is made of. There is something almost philosophical about this constraint, and it cuts to the heart of why deep time is so merciless. On Earth, we are surrounded by abundance so vast that we treat the planet as effectively infinite. If a machine breaks, we mine more metal. If we run short of an element, we dig deeper, or refine it from the sea, or pull it from the air. The whole crust of a world lies beneath our feet, and beyond it an entire solar system of raw material. A generation ship has none of this. It carries, at launch, every atom it will ever possess. There will be no new mining, no new refining, no new delivery of anything, ever, until it reaches its destination 1,000 years hence. Whatever the founders pack into the hull is the entire material wealth of that little world for its entire journey. And so the ship must become a closed loop, not just for air and water and food, but for everything. Every metal must be recoverable. Every plastic must be recyclable. Every rare and precious element, the exotic materials inside the electronics, the special metals in the reactor, the trace substances the farms and bodies need, must be tracked, conserved, and returned to use at the end of each thing's life. Nothing can be truly discarded because there is nothing to replace it. This is recycling not as a virtue but as an absolute law of survival, enforced not by morality but by the cold reality that there is no more. And yet, as we have seen, no recycling is ever perfect. Each time a thing is melted down and reforged, a little is lost. Each time an element passes through a chemical process, a fraction is locked away in some form that cannot be recovered. The losses are small, but the journey is long, and the relentless arithmetic of deep time turns small losses into large ones, until a ship that launched with abundance might, after many centuries, find itself running short of the materials it needs to keep repairing itself. Beneath all of this lies a principle so fundamental that the entire universe obeys it without exception. It is the tendency of all things to move from order toward disorder. A hot cup of coffee left alone always cools to match the room. It never spontaneously grows hotter while the room grows colder. A sandcastle crumbles into a formless heap, but a formless heap never spontaneously rises into a sandcastle. A living body, the most exquisitely ordered thing we know, holds itself together only through constant effort, taking in energy and casting out waste, and the moment that effort ceases, the body decays into the same disorder as everything else. This one-way slide from order to disorder is woven into the deepest fabric of reality, and there is no escaping it. Order can be created, but only by spending energy, and only locally, while disorder increases somewhere else to pay for it. A generation ship is the purest possible expression of this struggle. It is an island of fierce, intricate order, billions of components arranged in exactly the right way, surrounded by the vast and patient disorder of empty space. To hold that order together, it must spend energy without rest, fighting back the decay of every system, every part, every cell of every crew member, for 1,000 years. The instant that fight slackens, the instant the energy stops flowing or the vigilance fails, disorder rushes back in, and the ship begins its slide toward becoming just another cold and lifeless object drifting between the stars. This is why the true enemy of a generation ship is not any single hazard. It is not the radiation, or the impacts, or the failing reactor, or the fracturing society. These are merely the many faces of a single deeper foe. The enemy is time itself, and the slow universal tendency of everything to come undone. Every system aboard the ship is a small battle in a war against that tendency, and to win the whole war, you must win every battle, every day, for 10 centuries, without ever losing one that matters. That is the scale of what a generation ship truly asks, not to travel a great distance, but to hold back the universe's relentless slide into chaos in one small, fragile bubble, for longer than any human work has ever endured. There is a concept that captures this perfectly, and it comes from the second law of thermodynamics, one of the most ironclad rules in all of physics. Left to itself, everything tends toward disorder. Heat flows from hot to cold and never the other way on its own. Structure decays into chaos. Order requires constant energy to maintain, and the moment that energy stops flowing, the decay resumes. A generation ship is, in the most literal sense, a fortress built against the second law of thermodynamics. It is a small bubble of fierce, hard-won order, surrounded on every side by the vast, indifferent disorder of the cosmos. And to hold that bubble together, it must pour energy into the fight without rest, without pause, for a span of time that would swallow nations whole. The question is not really whether the ship can be built. Given enough resources, perhaps it could. The question is whether order can be maintained against entropy for 1,000 years by a community that must also maintain itself, govern itself, feed itself, and remember why it ever set out at all. So now we can finally try to answer the question we started with. How long could a generation ship actually survive in deep space? And the honest answer is that it depends entirely on which of these systems fails first. Let us imagine the most optimistic case. A ship built with extraordinary care, with redundancy layered upon redundancy, with a crew rigorously trained, and a culture deliberately engineered to preserve knowledge across the centuries. Even then, the dangers are stacked one upon another, each one a potential ending. A ship like this would be a monument to caution. Every critical system would exist, not once, but several times over, so that if one failed, another could take its place while the first was repaired. There would be backup recyclers, backup power, backup water purifiers, backup everything, layered like the rings of a tree, so that no single failure could ever bring the whole world down. The crew would be cross-trained, each person skilled in more than one role, so that the loss of any individual would not mean the loss of any irreplaceable knowledge. The knowledge itself would be preserved in many forms at once, taught person to person, written in archives, perhaps even built into the design of the machines, so that the way to repair them was woven into the things themselves. The culture would be deliberately shaped from the very beginning to value the mission, to honor the discipline of maintenance, to pass the sense of purpose down through the generations like a sacred trust. Children would be raised understanding that the ship was their whole world and that keeping it alive was the highest calling any of them could answer. In such a ship, every reasonable precaution would have been taken, every obvious danger anticipated and guarded against, every system made as robust as human ingenuity could manage. And still, the dangers would remain. Because no amount of caution can fully defeat deep time. You can make each failure unlikely. You cannot make it impossible. You can layer backup upon backup, but the backups are themselves machines that age and wear and eventually fail, and across 1,000 years even the deepest stack of redundancy can be worn through, one layer at a time, until the last one gives way. Even then, the dangers are stacked one upon another, each one a potential ending. The air system might run for decades flawlessly, and then a cascade of small failures, each individually survivable, might combine into something the crew cannot fix in time. The reactor might perform beautifully for centuries, and then crack in a way no one anticipated, leaving the ship to drift powerless in the dark. A disease might sweep through the closed population, a sickness with nowhere to hide from it and no fresh population to dilute it, burning through the crew faster than medicine can respond. Consider how dangerous illness becomes inside a sealed world. On Earth, a community that falls sick can draw on the resources of an entire planet, fresh medicine manufactured elsewhere, doctors flown in, the sick separated from the healthy across great distances. Aboard a ship, there is none of that. The same recycled air that keeps everyone alive also carries whatever sickness takes hold, circulating it through every compartment. The same close quarters that make the ship efficient also make it the perfect breeding ground for anything that spreads from person to person. And the medicines themselves are finite. The ship can carry only so much, and drugs degrade over time, losing their potency across the decades, until the carefully stocked pharmacy of the founders becomes a cabinet of useless powders for their distant descendants. To survive, the ship would need to manufacture its own medicine, to grow it, to synthesize it, adding yet another intricate system to the list of things that must never fail. And there is a subtler danger still. In total isolation, the immune systems of the crew, never challenged by the vast variety of microbes that bombard us on Earth, might grow strange and unpracticed, leaving the population unexpectedly vulnerable should some dormant organism, carried unnoticed from the beginning, suddenly flare into life generations later. Or the failure might not be physical at all. It might be social. The community might fracture into factions that fight over the ship's dwindling resources. A single charismatic leader might seize control and drive the mission off course. The descendants might simply lose the will to continue, choosing comfort and forgetting over the harsh discipline that keeps a closed world alive. Picture a generation, 3 or 4 centuries into the voyage, that has decided the mission no longer matters. They did not choose to be born aboard. They feel no loyalty to ancestors they never met, no pull toward a destination they will never see. To them, the ship is not a vessel of hope, but a prison, and the endless work of maintaining it is not a sacred duty but a burden imposed on them without consent. What happens then? They might simply stop caring for the systems with the rigor the ship demands. They might divert resources from the long-term mission toward short-term comfort. They might let the careful knowledge fade because they see no reason to preserve it. And a generation ship maintained carelessly is a generation ship already dying, even if no single dramatic failure has yet occurred. The slow rot of neglect can be as fatal as any explosion, only quieter and harder to see until it is far too late. Any one of these, alone, could end the voyage. And there is one more shadow hanging over the entire enterprise, one that has nothing to do with whether the ship survives and everything to do with whether the journey was worth making at all. The destination. When the founders choose their target star, they are choosing based on what they can see from a great distance, across light years of empty space. They might pick a star with a planet that appears, from afar, to be the right size, the right distance from its sun, perhaps even showing faint signs in its light of an atmosphere that could support life. But seeing a world across light years is not the same as standing upon it. The ship would spend centuries traveling toward a place no one aboard has ever truly examined, betting everything on a destination glimpsed only as a faint smudge of light filtered through enormous telescopes. And worlds can deceive. A planet that looks promising from afar might prove, on arrival, to be a poisoned place, its atmosphere unbreathable, its surface lashed by radiation, its chemistry hostile to everything the crew needs to live. The water that seemed to shimmer in its light might be locked in ice, or laced with substances that would sicken anyone who drank it. The very ground might be barren in ways no distant observation could reveal. Imagine the cruelty of it. A ship that beats every odd, that survives the radiation and the impacts and the failing machinery, that holds its society together across 40 generations, that arrives at last, after 1,000 years in the dark, only to find that the world it crossed the void to reach cannot sustain human life at all. The descendants of the founders, having given everything to complete the journey, would arrive at a closed door. And what then? Do they settle into orbit around a useless world and live out their lives aboard the only home they have ever known? The ship that was always meant to be a vessel becoming, by default, a permanent habitat? Do they choose another target and begin again, committing yet more unborn generations to yet another voyage into the dark? The destination, glimpsed across light years and trusted across centuries, is itself one of the great gambles of the entire idea, a bet placed by the founders that their distant descendants will be forced to honor, for better or for worse. Any one of these, alone, could end the voyage or render its ending hollow, and the cruel mathematics of it is this: the longer the journey, the more chances each of these failures has to occur. A risk that is small in any given year becomes very nearly certain across 1,000 years. If there is even a tiny chance each year that some unfixable catastrophe strikes, then stretched across the centuries, the odds of reaching the destination intact grow alarmingly slim. Let us sit with that arithmetic for a moment, because it is the cold heart of the whole matter. Suppose the ship is magnificently built, so well made that in any given year the chance of some final, unrecoverable disaster is small indeed, just one chance in a few hundred. That sounds wonderfully safe. In a single year, you would almost certainly be fine. In a decade, still very likely fine. But the journey is not a year or a decade. It is 1,000 years, and the danger does not reset. Each year, the dice are rolled again, and again, and again, 1,000 times over. A risk that is trivial in any single year becomes, when repeated across 10 centuries, very nearly a certainty. It is the same logic that makes a single coin flip harmless and 1,000 coin flips guaranteed to turn up many disasters along the way. The longer the rope, the more certain it is to find its weakest fiber. This is why duration is the true enemy. It is not that any one system is likely to fail this year. It is that across 1,000 years, something, somewhere, eventually will, and on a generation ship, the wrong failure at the wrong moment leaves no room for recovery. There is no rescue, There is no second attempt. There is only the one ship, the one chance, stretched across a span so long that the simple accumulation of small risks becomes overwhelming. And the failures are not even independent. They feed on one another. A power shortage strains the recyclers, which fouls the air, which sickens the crew, which thins the ranks of the very people needed to fix the power. A social fracture leads to neglect, which lets a system degrade, which triggers a crisis, which deepens the social fracture. The dangers are not a list of separate threats waiting politely in line. They are a web, each one capable of pulling the others down with it, so that a single stumble in one corner of the ship can cascade into a collapse that touches everything. If there is even a tiny chance each year that some unfixable catastrophe strikes, then stretched across the centuries, the odds of reaching the destination intact grow alarmingly slim. This is why many who have studied the idea seriously come to a sobering conclusion. A generation ship traveling at the slow speeds we could plausibly achieve, taking thousands of years to cross to even the nearest star, would face such a vast accumulation of risk that its chances of arrival might be very low indeed. The ship might survive a century. It might survive 5. But the full journey, the complete crossing of that ocean of darkness, demands a streak of unbroken success so long that it strains belief. And yet, the picture is not entirely hopeless, because the length of the journey is not fixed. It depends on how fast the ship can go. And here, oddly, is where the harshest problem points toward its own solution. If we could build a ship that travels not at a fraction of 1% of the speed of light, but at a substantial fraction of it, the entire calculation changes. A journey of thousands of years could shrink to mere decades. And a ship that only needs to survive for 40 or 50 or 60 years is a far, far more achievable thing than one that must endure for 1,000. At those speeds, you might not even need many generations at all. The crew who launched the ship might still be alive, grown old but living. When it arrives, a single human lifetime, or 2 instead of 40. The knowledge would not have time to be forgotten. The culture would not have time to drift beyond recognition. The reactor would not have to outlast empires. Only a working career. This is the great irony hidden inside the whole problem. The thing that makes a generation ship so terrifyingly fragile is not really the distance, it is the time. And time can be defeated, not by living longer, but by traveling faster. To understand why, it helps to see just how much the journey shrinks as the speed climbs. At the crawling pace of our fastest spacecraft today, the trip to the nearest star is a matter of thousands of years, a span across which every danger we have described has countless chances to strike. Lift the speed to 1/10 of the speed of light, a target so far beyond us today that it borders on fantasy, and that same journey collapses to a few decades. Lift it to 1/5 of the speed of light, and the nearest star draws within a span a single dedicated human could nearly cross in one working lifetime. The difference is staggering, and it changes the entire character of the problem. A ship that must survive 1,000 years is fighting a war it can almost never win, because somewhere across those 10 centuries, something will break that cannot be fixed. A ship that must survive only 40 or 50 years is fighting a battle that human engineering has at least a fighting chance of winning, because we already build machines and run institutions that last that long. At those higher speeds, the very nature of the voyage transforms. The founding crew might not need to hand the ship down through 40 generations. They might hand it down through only 1 or 2, or perhaps live to see the destination themselves, grown old but still present, still remembering the world they left and the reasons they came. The knowledge would not have time to erode. The language would not have time to drift beyond understanding. The society would not have time to forget its purpose, because the people who chose the purpose would still be alive to remember it. The reactor would not need to outlast empires, only a single human career. The farms would need to feed not a forgotten line of strangers, but the very people who planted them. In short, almost every problem we have described is really a problem of duration, and duration is the one thing that speed can cut down. This is the strange hope buried at the bottom of all the difficulty. The path to making a generation ship survivable does not run primarily through better recyclers, or stronger hulls, or wiser forms of government, though all of those would help. It runs through the engine. Build a fast enough ship, and the 1,000-year nightmare becomes a 50-year voyage. And a 50-year voyage is something human beings might actually accomplish. But here lies the cruelest twist of all. Going fast is not merely difficult. It is difficult in a way that grows worse the harder you push. To accelerate a city-sized ship to even a fraction of the speed of light demands an amount of energy almost beyond comprehension, dwarfing everything human civilization currently produces in a year, perhaps in a century. And the deeper trouble is the fuel. To go fast, you must carry fuel, and the more fuel you carry, the heavier the ship becomes, and the heavier it becomes, the more fuel you need to accelerate it, and that extra fuel adds yet more weight. This vicious circle, the tyranny of carrying your own propellant, has defeated every simple plan for fast interstellar travel ever proposed. Beyond a certain point, adding more fuel barely helps, because almost all of it is spent just moving the rest of the fuel. So the dreamers have reached for stranger ideas, ways to go fast without carrying the fuel at all. One vision imagines a sail, vast and gossamer thin, unfurled across kilometers of space, pushed not by any onboard engine but by an enormous beam of light fired from back home. A beam so powerful it could press the sail forward across the years like wind against a ship at sea. The ship would carry no fuel for acceleration at all, leaving that burden to the great engines left behind in our own solar system. Another vision imagines an engine that scoops up the thin gas drifting between the stars, the lonely atoms of hydrogen scattered through the void, and fuses them for power as it flies, gathering its fuel from space itself rather than carrying it from home. Still others imagine harnessing the most violent reactions physics permits, the annihilation of matter against its mirror image, releasing energy of a density nothing else can match. Each of these ideas is brilliant. Each is, on paper, possible within the laws of physics, and each lies so far beyond our present ability that it might as well be a wish. We cannot build a light beam powerful enough to push a sail to the stars. We cannot make a scoop that gathers interstellar gas faster than it slows the ship that carries it. We cannot produce or store the exotic fuel that the most powerful engines would demand. Not today. Perhaps not for centuries. But, and this matters, none of these ideas are forbidden. They are not impossible in the way that traveling backward in time is impossible, or exceeding the speed of light is impossible. They are merely, for now, far beyond our reach, problems of engineering and resources rather than violations of nature's deepest laws. And problems of engineering have a way of yielding, slowly, across the long, patient march of human ingenuity. And so the dream of the generation ship sits, suspended between two truths. At the slow speeds we can imagine today, the journey is so long that the ship would almost certainly fail somewhere along the way. Undone not by any single catastrophe, but by the simple, relentless arithmetic of accumulated risk across deep time. And at the fast speeds that would make the journey survivable, the engineering required is so far beyond us that it might as well be magic, at least for now. The truth is, that a generation ship is less a vehicle than a question. It asks us how well we truly understand the systems that keep us alive. It asks whether human beings can hold a society together across centuries, with no escape and no outside help. It asks whether knowledge can survive when it has nowhere to be written but in the fragile memories of a few thousand people. And it asks, most quietly of all, whether order can be defended against the patient hunger of entropy for longer than any human work has ever lasted. Imagine standing in the observation deck of such a ship, generations into the voyage. The corridors behind you are scarred with the small repairs of 100 years. The farms glow under their artificial suns. The recyclers hum their endless hum. And beyond the thick scarred armor of the hull, there is nothing. No earth. No sun you would recognize as home. Only the steady, unblinking stars, so distant that even at your tremendous speed they seem not to move at all. The whole sky frozen into a vast and silent dome. There is a particular strangeness to that frozen sky. On Earth, the stars wheel overhead through the night, rising and setting, the whole heavens turning with the spin of the planet. Aboard the ship, traveling between the stars, the view would be almost perfectly still. The destination star, far ahead, would brighten so slowly that across an entire human lifetime its growing light would be nearly imperceptible, a change measured not in a person's years but in a family's generations. The star left behind, the sun that warmed every ancestor back to the very first humans, would dwindle behind the ship, becoming just another point in the dark, indistinguishable from the countless others, until no one aboard could even say with certainty which faint light had once been home. To live aboard the ship would be to live inside a moment stretched across centuries, the scenery never changing, the journey so vast that motion itself becomes invisible, the great crossing happening so slowly that to any single pair of eyes it would look like perfect stillness. And in that stillness, the work would go on, the recyclers humming, the farms glowing, the reactor burning, the great wheel turning, the endless careful maintenance of a world performed by people who would never see it end in service of an arrival none of them would witness. Only the steady, unblinking stars, so distant that even at your tremendous speed they seem not to move at all. The whole sky frozen into a vast and silent dome. Your grandparents launched this ship. Your grandchildren will inherit it. And somewhere ahead, still impossibly far, is a star with a planet that no living human aboard has ever seen, that no living human aboard may ever see. You are not traveling to a destination. You are living inside the traveling itself. The voyage has become the world. Consider what an ordinary life would be aboard such a ship, generations into the dark. A child is born in a curving room beneath an artificial sky, and from the first moment, the world they know is the world inside the hull. They learn to walk on a floor that is also the inner skin of a spinning drum. They look up not at clouds, but at the far side of their own world, the distant fields and dwellings hanging overhead across the hollow center. They are taught very early that the air is precious, that the water has passed through 1,000 lives before theirs, that every machine humming in the walls is a thing their survival depends upon. They grow up, and they take their place in the great work of keeping the world alive. Perhaps they tend the farms, coaxing food from the soil under the steady artificial light. Perhaps they learn the deep secrets of the reactor, joining the small priesthood of those who understand the fire at the ship's heart. Perhaps they teach, passing the inheritance of knowledge to the children who will outlive them. They fall in love. They raise children of their own, children who will never know they had a choice in being born aboard. They grow old in the same corridors where they were young. And at the end, when their life is done, their body returns to the cycle, broken down and fed back into the soil, so that the very atoms that made them become part of the next harvest, the next generation, the next turn of the endless wheel. There is something profoundly moving in that, and something profoundly strange. These would be human lives, as full and real as any lived on Earth, full of love and work and loss and meaning, and yet lived entirely within a vessel hurtling through a darkness their ancestors chose and their descendants will inherit. They would never see a sunrise over a real horizon. They would never feel rain, or stand at the edge of an ocean, or look up at a sky that goes on forever. Their entire universe would be the inside of the ship, and the cold scattered stars glimpsed through its windows. Stars so distant that across an entire human lifetime they would seem never to move at all. And threading through all of it, generation after generation, would be the quiet weight of the mission. The knowledge that they are not merely living but carrying something, a fragile spark of life and hope and human presence, across a gulf so vast that no single life can span it. They are a relay, a chain of hands in the dark, each holding the torch for a while before passing it on, none of them living to see the flame finally arrive. You are not traveling to a destination. You are living inside the traveling itself. The voyage has become the world, and every breath you take, every drop of water you drink, every bite of food, depends on a machine that must never, ever be allowed to stop. How long could a generation ship survive in deep space? Long enough to be born on it, perhaps. Long enough to live a life, raise a family, grow old, and pass the ship to those who come after. Maybe long enough for several lifetimes, several generations, several handing-offs of the torch in the dark. But long enough to cross the unimaginable gulf to another star, at the crawling pace our physics permits today, and arrive with the lights still on and the air still sweet and the people still remembering why they came. That is the part where the dream meets the hard wall of reality. And it is the part that no engineer, no scientist, no dreamer has yet figured out how to guarantee. Perhaps one day we will build the faster engines that shrink the journey down to a survivable span. Perhaps one day we will learn to build machines that truly last, closed worlds that breathe and feed themselves for 1,000 years without a single fatal stumble. Perhaps one day a ship will set out, and 1,000 years later, against all the odds, a descendant of the original crew will look out through the armored glass and see, for the first time, the light of a new sun growing slowly brighter. Think about what that moment would mean. A child born in the final generation of the voyage, raised on stories of a destination that had always been impossibly far, would grow up and notice something their parents and grandparents never saw. The star ahead, which had been just one point of light among thousands for the entire history of the ship, would be growing brighter, slowly at first, then unmistakably, it would swell from a distant spark into something more, a true sun, with a real warmth, and perhaps beside it, the faint, patient glimmer of a world. The people aboard would be looking at the place their ancestors had aimed for across 10 centuries, a place no living human had ever seen as more than a smudge in a telescope, now resolving into something real before their eyes. They would be the inheritors of the longest journey in the history of their kind, the final link in a chain of hands, stretching back 1,000 years to people who chose to leave everything behind for the sake of a moment they knew they would never witness. Every breath those final descendants took would be air recycled from the breath of the founders. Every drop of water, the same water carried up from Earth 1,000 years before. The atoms in their bodies would be, in part, the very atoms that made the first crew, cycled through soil and crop and flesh across 40 generations. In a real and literal sense, the people who arrived would carry the founders within them, woven into their cells, even though the founders themselves had been gone for nearly 1,000 years. That is the strange immortality the generation ship offers. Not that any one person survives the journey, but that the chain survives. The continuity of life and purpose passed unbroken from hand to hand across the impossible dark. We are not there yet. We may not be there for a very long time. Perhaps one day a ship will set out, and 1,000 years later, against all the odds, a descendant of the original crew will look out through the armored glass and see, for the first time, the light of a new sun growing slowly brighter. We are not there yet. We may not be there for a very long time. But the question itself is worth holding on to, because in asking how a ship could survive 1,000 years alone in the dark, we are really asking something about ourselves. We are asking whether the fragile, miraculous order that keeps us alive on this one warm planet could ever be carried, deliberately, intentionally, across the cold and the distance and the deep time, to take root somewhere new. When you really look at it, the generation ship is a mirror. It forces us to see, in stark and simplified form, the thing we take most for granted, the staggering, intricate, endlessly maintained machinery that keeps any of us alive at all. We imagine that survival is the natural state of things, that life simply continues unless something dramatic interrupts it. But the generation ship reveals the opposite truth. Survival is not the default. Survival is an achievement, won every moment against the constant pressure of a universe that tends always toward cold and disorder and silence. On Earth, that achievement is so vast, so old, and so reliable that we mistake it for permanence. The air renews itself. The water cycles. The soil regenerates. The web of life repairs its own wounds. And all of it runs on the steady pouring of energy from the sun, balanced across a whole planet, sustained across billions of years. The generation ship asks us to do all of that ourselves, by hand, in a box, for 1,000 years, and in asking, it shows us just how much is being done for us, freely and invisibly, every single second of our lives. Perhaps that is the truest value of the whole strange thought experiment. Not as a blueprint for escape, but as a lesson in gratitude and humility. We are asking whether the fragile, miraculous order that keeps us alive on this one warm planet could ever be carried, deliberately, intentionally, across the cold and the distance and the deep time to take root somewhere new. The Earth, after all, is itself a kind of ship. A closed world, recycling its air and water and material in an endless loop, carrying every human being who has ever lived through the dark, around a star, through the galaxy, with no resupply and no escape. We have been the crew of a generation ship all along. Think of it. The Earth carries every human being who has ever lived through the void, with no resupply arriving from anywhere, recycling the same air through countless lungs, the same water through countless rivers and clouds and bodies, the same atoms cycling endlessly through soil and sea and living flesh. Our atmosphere is our hull, a thin shell of gas holding back the vacuum, so thin that if the planet were shrunk to the size of an apple, the breathable air would be thinner than the skin. Our magnetic field is our shielding, deflecting the same deadly radiation a starship would have to armor itself against. Our farms and forests and oceans are our life support, scrubbing the carbon dioxide from the air and breathing out the oxygen we need. A planetary recycler that has run without failing for billions of years. And we travel, too, far faster than any rocket, carried around our star, carried with our star around the galaxy. A journey across distances and spans of time that dwarf anything a starship would ever attempt. We did not choose to board. We were born aboard, every one of us, into a closed world we did not select, hurtling through a darkness we did not ask for, dependent utterly on systems most of us never think about and could not begin to repair. The only difference between us and the crew of a generation ship is that our ship is so vast, so ancient, and so generous that its life support has never yet failed us, and so we have forgotten we are passengers at all. But the lesson of the generation ship is that this forgetting is a luxury, not a fact of nature. The order that sustains us is not guaranteed. It is maintained, moment by moment, by the same patient balance that a starship would have to maintain by hand. Only here it is done for us, freely, by a world large enough that we mistake its care for permanence. We have been the crew of a generation ship all along, and perhaps the deepest lesson of imagining one is simply this. The thing that would keep a starship alive across 1,000 years is exactly the thing that keeps our world alive right now. Balance, care, the endless, patient work of holding order against the dark. It is the work that the recyclers of a starship would do, and it is the work that our oceans and forests and atmosphere do for us every second of every day. It is the work that keeps the air breathable, the water clean, the temperature mild, the whole impossible balance of a living world holding steady against a universe that would otherwise let it all slide into cold and silence. A generation ship would have to perform that work deliberately, with machines and human hands, for 1,000 years. Our world performs it for us automatically, on a scale so grand we never see the effort. And perhaps, once you have truly imagined how hard it would be to keep a tiny world alive in the dark for 10 centuries, you cannot look at this larger world the same way again. You begin to see the air as something precious, the water as something borrowed and returned, the fragile balance of the whole living system as something not owed to us, but quietly, generously given, moment by moment, by a ship we never built and could never replace. The only difference is that our ship is so vast, so ancient, and so generous that we have forgotten we are aboard it at all. Thank you for taking this journey into the cosmos with me. If you made it this far, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more journeys into the unknown. And remember, we are all of us already passengers on a ship through the stars.